This is the first Sunday in Lent, and as always, every year, the first Sunday of Lent, we pause to look at the temptation of Jesus. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons for that. First of all, it gives us a nice setup for the 40 days in the desert, but it's also the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and it's a beginning of reflection and awareness. As the story goes, Jesus goes right from baptism right out into the desert where he fasts for 40 days and 40 nights and is faced with temptations. Now that's the quick and dirty of the story, but there's so much symbolism in it. And we have to pay attention to the fact that it is symbolism. This is not a literal story. In fact, news broke just 10 days ago that yet another right wing conservative, this time in Mozambique, died because they tried to emulate the 40 days feast or fasting of Jesus. Every year, people die treating this story as a literal occurrence, and it's not. It is highly symbolic. Everything about this is incredibly symbolic. So we're going to break it down a little bit. First of all, the 40 days. In the Hebrew tradition, 40 is a period of judgment. In that culture, along with the Persians, the Greeks, a lot of them, they felt that the 40 was the arrival, the epoch, the highlight of a person's life. So you basically, that was a generation. That was the time when you have reached maturity enough to understand the mysteries of life. Number 40, I mean, we have Noah in the ark for 40 days and then waiting for the water to go for another 40 days. We have Elijah going up to the mountains, walking to Mount Tabor in 40 days. We have Moses fasting in the mountain for 40 days a few times. We have the 40 years that the Hebrews, the Israelites, were outside of the promised land. So the number appears over and over and over again. And if you were a first century Hebrew person, Christ follower, you recognize this. You got this. This was to situate Jesus within the Hebraic tradition, and it does it quite nicely. The 40 days is a period of judgment, a period of testing, a period where God put people through things. The fasting was, as we talked about on Ash Wednesday, the fasting was yet another tool to help people understand, get them closer to God, a little bit of self-denial so that prayer was a little easier, a little more focused. It certainly was not an experience. If there's any literal truth to this at all, it was certainly not an experience where you did without food or water for 40 days, because that is death. And so many people have discovered that over the 2 millennia when they have tried to emulate a literal reading of that. It's not. Fasting, it goes hand in hand with prayer. And we saw this on Ash Wednesday. We'll continue to see it through Lent. So that's the 40 days, and that's the fasting. I think it's actually kind of interesting that right after baptism, Jesus goes out to the desert and waits. This is also really a great paradigm for church leaders. When we have new people come into the congregation, we have newly people baptized, don't give them a job right away. Let them feel their ground. Let them wrestle with what this thing with Christianity is. Let them have some kind of sense that how is my lifestyle now different than it was before baptism? Because if it isn't, then what was the point in the first place? So people who make this choice as adults, they want to feel that difference. Give them that space. God gave Jesus that space. The Bible gave Jesus that space to kind of wrestle with what he was going to. And the wrestling, that comes with Hasatan. So Hasatan was something the Hebrew people inherited from the Babylonians, actually, during the Babylonian exile. It was an entity, a being in the Babylonian tradition that the Hebrews liked, and they brought it over and they read it back into Job and they read it back into other places in the scripture. But essentially, Hasatan, the challenger, the examiner, the tempter, is strictly that. It's to pose situations where Jesus had to really wrestle with his response. And the situations posed by Hasatan and Diablos. Diablos is the Greek version. Diablos, the root word actually means to divide. And the root word, when it's turned into a verb, actually means to throw over. So like a spear or an arrow or some kind of ballistic item that they're throwing over in a battle. So the words are kind of related. It does not mean a little guy with a red pitchfork and big ears and bad temper. That came centuries later. The Dark Plague, actually, the Black Plague, that's when a lot of that imagery came about because they needed to understand why bad things were happening. But back in Jesus' day, no, it was just a divider, the tempter, the one who is part of the heavenly realm, whose job it is to test the person who is about to do something heroic. That's all Hasatan and Diablos is. The one who is going to try to divide you from your way, who's going to tempt you to leave what you wanted to do. That doesn't work in this case. But Jesus, weakened, praying, trying to get his head wrapped around what the job is that he has to do, is tempted in three ways. And the ways kind of increase as they go. The first one is turn these stones into bread. I know you're hungry. Feed yourself. So a temptation where Jesus has to prioritize himself, put himself first. And he reaches in and he grabs onto scripture and he says, we do not tempt God. There is more to life than bread. And then the next one, the Hasatan, the temptation, is a little higher. I mean, the first one's kind of on the ground. It's personal, it's individual, it's about self-satisfaction, self-preservation. The next one, temptation puts Jesus on the top of a synagogue or a pinnacle of some kind, some important building that would have had a point to it, and says to look at Jerusalem and look at all these people going around. Look, you can tempt God by just throwing yourself off. We know you're special, so just get the angels to save you as you fall down, because we know not a single bit of your foot was going to be rubbed against the rock. Now, this is a temptation of testing God. And it's a temptation that we all fall into. Every single one of us has an experience of tempting God. And Jesus says we'll not tempt God. That is not how. We don't need to turn God into a party trick. And then the third temptation, up once again, so the ground, top of a building to now on a cliff. And Diablos is saying, look at all of these people here. They are ready for you to rule them. Follow me, worship me. I will give you responsibility for all of these people. Now, the whole temptations have gone from self to religious and family and faith community to the whole world. And again, Jesus says we're to worship God alone. And then temptation goes away. And the angels do come, and they feed Jesus, and he is restored, and he is ready now for his ministry. As we'll see in Matthew, he'll go, he'll heal a few people, he'll talk to a few people, and then he gets right into the Beatitudes. Very much keeping in line with the ministry of Moses, because as I said last week, there is a through line of Jesus being the new Moses in all of Matthew's writing. But this temptation was necessary to get Jesus to kind of focus on what had to happen. And it's not just an isolated thing. If you look at Jesus' ministry, these temptations come up again and again and again. And if you look at our own lives, they come up again and again and again. It is so tempting to just focus on ourselves and lack focus on anybody else. Those of us in leadership, it is really easy to try to gain power and prestige in ourselves rather than recognize that there's something bigger at play. For those who are very convinced of magicalness of Jesus and of God, and the very conviction that nothing is going to happen to them if they're faithful people, they're always testing God. See, if I take the snake, if I drink this thing, if I do something else, God will protect me. And you know what? Often they die or hurt themselves. And then they take that as proof that God never actually existed. We do that when we turn God into Santa Claus or some kind of gift-giving entity that, oh, I didn't get what I wanted, therefore God doesn't exist. I didn't get what I wanted, therefore God is punishing me. These are temptations that we have all experienced, that we've all heard of, that we've all lived through. But Jesus goes back and encourages us. The paradigm is right there. The method is right there. Jesus says, go back and grab scripture. Have a really good look at what God has taught us to do. Now, everything Jesus quoted was from the book of Deuteronomy, but there's other passages in the Christian scriptures now that we can pull from too. Do not tempt God. Do not be tempted by the easy, by the flighty, by power. Focus on God, even when it's hard. When that temptation is there, when that voice is around you telling you, oh, you know you want this, focus on God. And that will help you make the right decisions. It helps us all make the right decisions. And it makes it easier for us to follow the will of God, whatever that looks like for each of us. Do not get caught up in thinking this story is about good versus evil. It's not. Temptation and the right choices are not personified individuals. They're within us. Being very easily tempted, being weakened to the point of giving in to those temptations, that's in us. We don't need to blame an outside source. And Jesus didn't blame an outside source. This is just the process of examination that he went through to see if there could be a diabolos, a divide between his calling and his actions. We can find out whether or not we fall into that divide and whether we can renew ourselves to maybe next time not be so easily tempted, not fall into it so graciously, not be turned around by what the world wants us to be. Following Jesus can be very, very difficult, but is ultimately the most fulfilling thing we are asked to do.